Hello and welcome, everyone. We're so glad that you could be joining us for our webinar today. My name is Stephanie, and I'll be one of your co-hosts for today's webinar. Now, the webinar today is a part of our larger BrainHQ Academy series, where we can talk about the neuroscience behind different various topics. Now, today's topic is how your environment affects brain health. Let's take a look at the agenda for today. So, shortly after this introduction, we're going to go ahead and do an activity that we're calling Sound Pollution Story Time. More on that when we get there. Following that, Dr. Henry Manka is going to go ahead and give a presentation on the topic. Now, Henry is a frequent flyer here within these webinars, but for those of you who haven't met Henry yet, Dr. Henry Manka earned his PhD in neuroscience at the University of California, San Francisco, and that's where he studied brain plasticity with our co-founder, Dr. Michael Marcinek. He's been running the show here as the CEO of Posit Science since 2011. Following Henry's presentation, we are going to be joined in discussion by Dr. Jyoti Mishra, which we are so excited to have. Now, Dr. Mishra is a cognitive neuroscientist and founder of the Neural Engineering and Translation Labs, or NEAT Labs for short, at UCSD. Now, her lab innovates technologies for scalable brain health mapping and precision therapeutics. NEAT Labs conducts research across the lifespan in both local and global communities. Now, Dr. Mishra's research emphasizes scalable tech solutions that can help address important issues, including sustained psychological health and well-being, as well as resilience in the context of climate change, which we are very excited to talk to her about. She also co-directs the University of California-wide Climate Change and Mental Health Initiative. So, Jyoti, we're so glad that you could be joining us today. Following the discussion between Jyoti and Henry, we'll go ahead and open up the floor to live Q&A from you all, the audience. So if at any point during the presentation you'd like to ask a question, you can click on the Q&A button on the Zoom control panel and a new window will pop up. Type in your questions there, and then we'll do our best to answer as many of those questions as we can when we get to the Q&A section at the end of the webinar. Now, the last thing that I wanted to note is that today's webinar is being recorded and it will get posted to our YouTube channel in the coming days. If you'd like to be notified when that video goes live, you can go to youtube.com/BrainHQ and subscribe there in order to receive an email notification when that video goes live. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and switch over to our activity now. All right, so the activity for today's webinar is a fun one that we are calling Sound Pollution Story Time. So fun one, right? So Henry is going to read off a short story about a little bird named Chirpy. After the story is finished, we'll give you all a short quiz via a poll here on Zoom. Now, while he's reading, you're going to hear some noise and sound effects in the background, and that's by design. Just listen as best you can. And more on why we're doing that after the story ends. All right, so Henry, go ahead and take it away whenever you're ready.
Sounds perfect. And of course, Stephanie, the reason that we're doing this is that noise pollution is a form of environmental pollution. And we can't pump bad air to your laptop, nor would we want to. And we certainly can't shoot pesticides to the internet to your laptop over Zoom, nor would we want to. But noise pollution is something we can try out a little bit. So I'm going to dive into the story. Are we ready? See.
Ready.
Okay. Once upon a time, there was a little yellow bird named Chirpy who lived in a big city. Chirpy loved to race his friends and play hide and seek, but more than anything else, he loved to sing. But the noise of the city was so loud sometimes that he could barely hear himself think. The cars honked, the trains screeched, and the people shouted. Chirpy had almost given up trying to sing over the sounds of the city. But one day, Chirpy was playing hide and seek with some friends in a big park. There were beautiful trees, a few ball fields, gardens, and plenty of playgrounds. Chirpy saw a group of children having fun at a nearby playground, and he noticed that he could actually hear the children laughing and talking. They weren't being drowned out by the city sounds. Chirpy was so happy to hear this that he landed on his wings and started to sing, completely forgetting about the game of hide and seek. The little yellow bird sang and sang. Children listened and admired his songs. When Chirpy was finished singing, the children clapped and cheered. Chirpy was so happy that he had found a place where he could sing without being bothered by the noise of the city. Remembering the game of hide and seek, he quickly sought out his friends and excitedly told them about the playground. The next day, all of Chirpy's friends went to the playground to sing together. Chirpy and his friends were so happy to have a safe place to live and sing. They continued to sing every day, and their singing brought joy to everyone who heard it.
And you can hear a little bit of chirpy there at the very end. All
How'd that
right,
go, Stephanie?
fantastic. All right, so let's go ahead and launch our little pop quiz here for you all. So there are 3 questions. First one, what color is Chirpy? Is Chirpy yellow, blue, or red? What is Chirpy's favorite activity? Does he like playing hide and seek, singing, or racing his friends? And where did the children first hear Chirpy? Was he calling to them from a tree? Was it at the ballpark, or was it on a playground? So it looks like many of you already started submitting answers, which is fantastic. Since there are 3 questions here in this poll, you might have to scroll down to see all of the options. But yeah, it looks like the answers are coming in great here. Now, Henry, do you want to maybe talk about why we created this activity the way that we did?
Sure. As I sort of mentioned, of course, noise pollution is a form of pollution. And, if you are hearing someone talk, like I was telling the story, if a lot of other noise is happening, that's going to interfere with your brain's ability to process that speech. And if your brain can't process that speech correctly in the first place, it's going to be hard to understand it. It's going to be hard to pay attention to it. It's going to be hard to remember it. And if you're BrainHQ users, you probably know about that because there are a lot of exercises in BrainHQ designed to improve how your brain processes speech. But we do this because this is a short-term form of noise pollution. And we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between short-term noise and the long-term effects of noise pollution. This is kind of a cool way to start off by making us all realize that, well, noise has an effect on brain function and even perhaps brain health.
Yeah, absolutely. And it looks like we can kind of see that actually a little bit here from the results of the poll. I'll go ahead and end that since it looks like the majority of people have joined in here. And I'll go ahead and share the results. So first question, what color is Chirpy? This was mentioned at the very beginning of the story and then once during a very loud portion of the story. Chirpy is yellow. And we can see that maybe there was some confusion there, maybe because the slide was a little bit misleading and the bird that I have on the slide is red. But a lot of people also voted for red. Now, what is Chirpy's favorite activity? Again, sort of getting clouded by all that extra sound in the background. But his favorite activity is singing. And then where did the children first hear Chirpy? It was on the playground. He went to the playground where they were playing and then sang for them there. So we can see from these answers that, not every answer was consistent just because there was all that extra background noise that was sort of funneling up our brain processing speed there.
Oh, and we'll talk about what happens if your brain gets fuddled like that for a long period of time as a result of noise in your environment. All right, Stephanie, shall I grab the screen share?
Yep, go on ahead.
All right, wonderful. So I'm going to take off where Stephanie left off and dive into how your environment can affect your brain health. And, of course, if you've been coming to these brain health academies over the months, you've learned a ton around, hey, the actions you can take in your personal life that influence your brain health, right? We've talked about the role of diet and how it can improve brain health. And of course, the role of exercise. And we've talked about the role of sleep in building a stronger, more resilient brain, and even the role of stress or avoiding stress in your brain's health. And of course, the role of social interactions, which is so important for brain health. And if you're here, you're probably a BrainHQ user. You've probably heard a lot from us around the importance of brain training and building brain health. But these are all things that you can do kind of in your immediate life. They're all things that are kind of under your control that affect your brain health. And when we talk about the environment, well, these are things that are perhaps much broader and in some sense that are outside of our immediate control that can affect our brain health. And we're going to talk about 3 things today in particular. We're going to talk about the role of noise and noise pollution in brain health. We're going to talk about the role of environmental pollution and in particular pesticides in brain health. And we're also going to talk about the role of air pollution, which is such a current issue with wildfires in my home state of California and more recently on the East Coast, and what those might be doing to our brain health over time. So let's start off by talking about noise pollution. Here are these poor guys with these loudspeakers. And, the first thing to say about noise pollution is, well, we already, of course, know that loud noises can break hair cells and cause hearing loss. This is Pete Townsend, the legendary guitarist of The Who, known for, getting up on the stage and windmilling and, playing as loud as they possibly could. And, what we've recognized over time is, well, that damages the hair cells that are in your ear that actually convert the vibrations in the air that are sound into the neural impulses that convey that sound information to your brain. This is a picture of those hair cells. And on the top, each of these little U-shaped sort of shapes that you see is a group of these hair cells that are devoted to, again, converting those sound waves into neural impulses. And here's that's an image of those hair cells after they've been damaged due to loud noise exposure. And you can see they get floppy and they fall over, and in some cases they're gone entirely. And that's why we can have hearing loss just as we get older and our hair cells wear out. Or in Pete Townsend's case, he had hearing loss and tinnitus when he was relatively young because of this loud noise exposure. He's actually gone on to form a nonprofit that helps educate musicians about noise exposure and hearing loss. Now, that's an acute form of hearing loss, right? You're at a rock concert, or maybe you're Pete Townsend and you're running the rock concert, and you're going to have loud noise for an hour or two, and hey, that can cause some damage. But what about a different kind of noise pollution? What kind of noise pollution where it's not so loud that it hurts us, but it's just kind of ongoing noise that comes from, well, living in the modern world? Can that have an effect on brain health? Well, here we're going to turn the clock back a little bit and ask that question. And this was asked in a very interesting way by a group of scientists, both at the University of Oregon and at the State University of New York. And they took advantage of what one might call a natural experiment. So what we're looking at here is a very famous set of apartment buildings in Manhattan called the Bridge Apartments in Manhattan. And one of the reasons they're famous is that it's kind of an interesting place to build an apartment building. You can see it is built literally on top of a huge freeway that connects Manhattan to the rest of New York. And, it probably seemed like a good idea when they were building this apartment building. This was an efficient use of space, after all. But it caused a lot of complaints over time. You can imagine if you lived in this apartment building, you might complain about the pollution from the cars, and you might complain about the noise. Well, that did happen and caused a lot of discussion, but these scientists went and did some science based on this. And in particular, what they realized is that, hey, the noise was going to be highest down here on the lowest floors, because that's where we're closest to the cars. And the noise was going to be quietest up on the upper floors. So they went to the building and they worked with the residents there, and they actually tested more than 50 kids who lived in the apartment buildings. And some of them lived at the top with the least noise exposure, and some of these kids lived at the bottom with the most noise exposure. And what this study found was that the lower the floor that the kid lived on, the more noise from traffic, as you might expect. But then these kids had the lowest auditory performance scores. And in particular, they tested them using a test that you might know from BrainHQ. They gave them various confusable words. And if you've done exercises like to-do list training, or you've done exercises like sound replay, you've heard BrainHQ give you words that kind of rhyme and are a little bit confusable and mixed up. Well, the closer these kids were to the ongoing noise of the traffic, when they were tested in the lab, again, without traffic noise, the lower their auditory cognitive skills were. And the lower their auditory performance scores were, the fewer words those kids knew, which of course was made a challenge for them at school. So this is really one of the first demonstrations that noise pollution itself could affect brain performance in this way, and even brain health. But the question, of course, at that point, well, was why? And, at the time, scientists thought, well, maybe this had to do with attention and distraction, right? These kids were being raised in a noisy environment. Maybe they just didn't pay attention as much when their parents or other adults were speaking to them because of the traffic noise. And so there were these sort of psychological or cognitive explanations for what was going on. And no doubt that's to some extent true, but it turns out that this kind of noise actually directly affects brain organization and brain health. And for this, we turned to experiments that were done by Posit Science's co-founder, Dr. Michael Merznick, and collaborators of his at the University of California, San Francisco. And what they looked at was, well, what happens to the brains of, in this case, rats who grow up in noisy environments? And I'm going to show you two kind of schematic images of rat brains. And we'll talk a little bit about how the brain develops in a very young animal, or equivalently in a very young person. So here we're looking at a schematic of the surface of the brain of a baby rat. This rat has really been born relatively recently. And we're looking at the auditory parts of the brain, the parts of the brain that respond to sound. And what this color coding tells us is, well, blue areas respond to low sounds, like the low notes of a piano, and red areas respond to high sounds, like the high notes on the piano. But you can see that there's a big area that responds to sound, and it's only kind of well organized. And this cross shading here shows us areas that kind of just respond to a lot of sounds. And there's even parts of this auditory region of the brain shown in white that don't respond to any sound at all. And that's very typical for young animals or young people. When we're born, our brains are kind of noisy and disorganized. Then those researchers looked at a rat who had grown up a little bit, so sort of the equivalent of a teenage rat, one might say. And now when they look at the organization of the auditory parts of the brain, it's beautifully well organized. Here are the low notes shown in blue. Here are the medium notes shown in yellow. Here are the high notes shown in red. There's an organization that looks, well, very much like a piano going from low to high. And then they asked the question, what if this baby rat grew up in a noisy environment, kind of like those kids in that apartment? And so they had these rats and they just kind of played some staticky noise in the areas where the rats lived for the days and days and days as the rats grew up. And then when they looked at those young rats who were raised in noisy environments, they saw something kind of incredible, which is the rat auditory brain never actually grew up, so to speak. That noise actually retarded the development of the brain so that the brain of the young rat, which should have been well organized for hearing rat sounds, was still noisy and disorganized, as if the rat had never really heard much in the way of organizing sounds. Now, that's pretty interesting from a brain health perspective, to see that noise exposure like this can dramatically change or impede the organization of a key part of our brain. And it raises a very natural question. We know that these kinds of noisy information processing in brains, when the brain is not well organized and doesn't respond quickly and accurately, well, we know that these issues actually lead to cognitive impairment in humans. You know, as people get older, if they start to develop cognitive impairment, well, we can see that information processing in their brains is not terribly well organized also. So that made scientists wonder, well, does exposure to this kind of ongoing noise lead to brain health problems in older adults as well? And in fact, that turns out to be the case. Researchers have looked at this in a number of studies. I'm going to mention one here that was actually done close to my hometown. I live in San Francisco. This study was actually done in Sacramento. And these researchers looked at more than 1,600 older adults who lived in Sacramento, and they studied them for 9 years, which gave them the opportunity to see, well, who might go on to a diagnosis of dementia or Alzheimer's, and who might have a healthy brain. And what they also did is they looked at everyone's home address, and they calculated, well, how much traffic noise occurs at that home address. You know, are you living next to the intersection of a freeway and hear noise from trucks all day long and all night long? Or do you live in a big house that's isolated off in the woods where maybe you're only going to hear the noise of nature and babbling brooks? And what then happens to brain health? Well, they saw something amazing and a little bit scary, which is that the more noise a person was exposed to over the 9 years that were being studied, the higher the risk was of dementia. So this little white triangle here shows people who experienced the least noise. If you experienced a bit of noise, your dementia risk went up a bit. And if you experienced more than about 70 decibels of noise in an ongoing way, your dementia risk was actually about 20% higher than people who lived in the quiet. Now, how much noise is 70 decibels of noise? Well, it's about like hearing your washing machine if you've been out to a laundromat or maybe you have laundry in your house. So it's not enough to hurt your ears. You know, it's not like going to hear Pete Townsend play at a Who concert, but it's just kind of the ongoing constant noise of traffic like that. And it seems like what might be happening is that's leading the brain to become a little bit noisier and more disorganized. And as a result, increasing the risk of dementia in this population of people. So that's one way that our environment can affect our brain health. And in this case, not in a good way. Let's take a look at a second example. You know, here we looked generally at dementia and Alzheimer's, But another question people asked a while ago, starting in the 90s, was, well, are there environmental risk factors that are associated with Parkinson's disease in particular? Now, you may know that Parkinson's disease is often thought of as a movement disorder. People who get diagnosed with Parkinson's disease can have a tremor where their hand tremors as they try to do things. Often they have problems getting up out of a chair or walking. And in general, they have problems initiating movement. And for a long time, it really wasn't clear why. People thought, well, maybe it's just random, it's bad luck. Maybe it's genetics. People have certain bad genes that lead into Parkinson's. But in the early 90s, a group of researchers at the University of Kansas took a very close look at this, and they looked at people who had Parkinson's and who didn't, and who lived in rural environments and lived in urban environments. And they kind of compared and contrasted them to see, well, what similarities existed and what differences existed. And they identified three main sources of difference between people who seemed like they were more likely to go on to Parkinson's and people who were less likely to go on to Parkinson's. First difference that they identified was what they called a rural living factor. People who lived on farms, people who reported that their main source of water was well water and other things like that were at elevated risk for Parkinson's. That was a pretty big surprise. The second thing they noticed, and this is their language, not mine, was that risk factors related to what they called being a man increased the risk of Parkinson's. And they were thinking of things like smoking and drinking. But in particular, they noticed that people who worked in agribusiness had an elevated risk of Parkinson's. Now, at that time, it was mostly men who had worked in agribusiness because this was back before women were, frankly, allowed to do very much of this kind of work. So that was an interesting factor. And then the third factor that they noticed quite clearly was that exposure to pesticides. People who were exposed to applying pesticides in fields more than 20 days per year had an increased risk of Parkinson's. And this was a pretty interesting result because, in fact, you can look at all of these things and think, well, they're kind of united by pesticide exposure. You know, if you're drinking well water, even if you're not exposed to pesticides directly, well, it can creep into well water sources. If you're working in agribusiness, the same kind of thing. And so this raised the question, well, are some of these pesticides actually an environmental hazard that's related to brain health? It turns out that certain pesticides do seem like they damage the neurons that are involved in Parkinson's disease. And so to say a few words about that, you know, here is the side view of a rat brain here. This is the front, and this is the top of the brain, and this is the back. And the neurons that are involved in Parkinson's disease, they're a very interesting set of neurons. The main body of the neuron is located here towards the bottom of the brain where the spinal cord comes in, but they send projections all over the brain. And these neurons are very active because, of course, they're involved in movement control. And that means they need to build a lot of things to keep themselves going. And that means they need to use a lot of energy in order to keep themselves working. And it turns out that two of these most common pesticides, one that's called paraquat and one that's called rotenone, you know, the way they work is they actually inhibit a cell from using energy. Now, they do that really well in insects, which is why they are great pesticides. And they do it not very well in people, which is why these were generally thought of as safe. But scientists now think that even though these have minimal effects on a cell's ability to use energy, because these cells that are involved in Parkinson's disease use so much energy that, you know, there is a low risk, but nonetheless a meaningful one, that exposure to these pesticides damages these cells and over a long period of time increases the risk of Parkinson's disease. And lo and behold, when scientists went out to investigate this, they found a strong link. In this case, these are scientists who worked with what's called the Agricultural Health Study. This has about 85,000 farm workers, primarily located in Iowa and North Carolina. And these scientists identified about 115 who went on to Parkinson's, and 383 who were very similar, did the same kind of job, you know, were the same age, the same gender, the same education level, but who didn't go on to Parkinson's. And they looked for differences between those populations. And what they found out was a big difference was how much they had been exposed to these two pesticides, paraquat and rotenone. And in both cases, the relative risk of developing Parkinson's disease was about 2.5 times as high for agricultural workers who had been exposed to these pesticides quite a lot. Now, these are only risk factors. Parkinson's isn't that common. You know, if your lifetime risk of developing Parkinson's is maybe 1 or 2%, well, exposure to these pesticides means that your risk was maybe 3 or 4%. It's not a death sentence. It doesn't guarantee that you're going to go on to Parkinson's disease, but it does seem like it is an environmental risk factor that elevates the risk of developing this brain health problem. So let's talk about one more kind of environmental risk that's related to brain health. And here we're going to turn our attention to recent events, actually. This is a view from my house in San Francisco. It's a picture that I took on September 11th in the year 2000 at noon. And hey, normally San Francisco is quite beautiful at noon in September. Blue skies, and you can see the ocean and the trees. And my family will always remember this day as the day in San Francisco where the sun simply didn't rise. I remember I was working at home because, of course, it was during the COVID emergency, and around 10 o'clock, I looked out the window and wondered why it wasn't daytime yet. My daughter and I walked up a nearby hill and took this picture. And what was happening, of course, at that time is we were experiencing extreme wildfire events in California. And a tremendous amount of wildfire smoke had blown into San Francisco. And because it was foggy, that smoke had been dispersed across the fog, and the sunshine coming through the fog was, then dispersed in this very kind of weird orange pumpkin-like sky that lasted all day long. And if you've been following the news, you've seen that's happened on the East Coast this year. This is actually a picture of my hometown. I grew up in Washington, D.C., and this was taken on June 7th around noon. And what we're looking at here is the National Cathedral, which is one of the most beautiful buildings in Washington, D.C. And on this day, it could barely be seen because there was so much wildfire smoke. And if you were following the news, you probably saw that smoke came down from Canada, where they're experiencing these high number of wildfires. So we're brain scientists. One wonders, well, does this have effects on brain health? We, of course, know it has effects on respiratory health and on asthma and on all kinds of things like this. But how about our brains? Well, to answer this question, we might ask, well, what's in air pollution exactly? Like when we see that sort of smoke and haze, what are we talking about? Well, there are a lot of potential sources. Here I've mentioned, of course, wildfires. But there's air pollution that comes from industrial, work, from factories and other things that come on. There's air pollution that comes on from cars driving around. There's even air pollution that gets caused by burning gas in our homes, like gas stoves. And there's all kinds of types, right? There's carbon monoxide, which of course is poisonous if very much of it builds up in our house. There's ozone. There's heavy metals like lead. There's particulate matter, and this just means little tiny, particles that are left over from burning. Think of like soot and so forth. There's nitrogen dioxide and sulfur dioxide. But let's talk about particulate matter in particular. Now, for a long time, people thought, well, how much could this matter? It's just little bits of stuff. Maybe it gets into your lung, but how much damage could it do your brain? But it turns out that these tiny particles actually can have a pretty direct effect on brain health. They're called PM, particulate matter 2.5. That refers to how big they are. We're talking about particles that are much smaller than a human hair. But a couple things happen as these particles get into your body. First of all, they cause an inflammation response across your body. Your body attacks them just like you've been infected by a bacteria or a virus. And raising your body's inflammation levels, well, that causes all kinds of health risks, including heart attacks, but causes brain health issues as well. But even more interestingly, it seems like these very tiny particles can move across the blood-brain barrier. And that's a system in your body that normally defends your brain. It means that stuff that's in your blood that might not be so good for your brain, well, it's not permitted to enter the vulnerable tissue of your brain. But these very tiny particles seem like they can move across the blood-brain barrier. They probably damage the blood-brain barrier as they move across it, meaning your blood-brain barrier becomes more leaky and other toxins can enter your brain. And these particles can actually carry toxins into your brain. Like maybe there's a little bit of lead attached to these particles, and normally lead is kept out of your brain, but it leaks in a little bit during these events. So what happens to your brain if you're exposed in a long-term way to this kind of particulate matter? Well, a group of scientists in Korea actually asked this question, and they worked with almost 1,000 people living across urban and rural regions of Korea. And again, they were able to study them over a period of 6 or 7 years, and they were able to figure out, well, how much air pollution existed in their neighborhoods over this period of time. And again, some of them lived close to factories, and some of them lived out in the countryside. And what they found was kind of amazing. These are images of the brain now, and these red and yellow areas are areas of the brain that are less thick. They seem like they've been thinned out in people who have relatively high exposure to this kind of air pollution, this kind of particulate matter. And that seems to suggest that breathing it in this way, as well as causing breathing difficulties or asthma, is directly affecting, the thickness of our brain and how well our brain works. And one more time, we can ask the question, well, if that happens over time, does that affect our overall health? Does that affect our risk of dementia? And in this case, a group of scientists worked with the Women's Health Initiative that actually worked with women all across the country. And there have been many, many research publications that have come out of this. But in particular, these researchers identified about 3,600 women where they had genotype data, and they also had data from their pollution exposure over time based on where they lived. And once again, and you're probably starting to get the sense of this now, they found out that this kind of pollution increased the risk of dementia. If they looked at women who were in areas with low particulate matter and compared them with women in areas of high particulate matter, there was more than an 80% increase in the risk of having cognitive decline and an almost a 70% risk in going on to dementia. So that ongoing exposure in the same way seemed like it caused those brain health problems. So, that's a lot of maybe slightly worrisome news, right? Noise pollution, pesticides, air quality problems. These all are attacking our brains in various different ways. And often there's not a lot we can do about that, right? We might live near a freeway, or we might have wildfires come over our life. What can we do about it? Well, two things. So first of all, everything that we've talked about in other brain health academies that's good for the brain, diet and exercise and sleep and stress reduction and social contact and brain training, all of these helps builds a brain resilience, and having a more resilient brain unto itself can lower a brain's risk for having these negative outcomes of noise and air pollution and pesticides. But it turns out that actually being in nature itself can be good for cognitive function. And so here's another natural experiment that was done by scientists in an apartment building. These are the Robert Taylor homes in Chicago. This is an old picture of them. And, they look like big urban apartment buildings. But one interesting thing about them is, well, some places you might live in these apartments have better views of greenery and nature. And others, you don't see anything really that's green. You just see concrete. And researchers here, they actually evaluated 145 women who lived in these apartment buildings across 18 different buildings. And it turns out half of them had kind of better views of greenery from their apartments, and half of them, well, had worse views of greenery from their apartments. And it turns out that the people who lived with better views of greenery, who experienced nature more in that way, they actually had better attention scores. And as a result, they had lower levels of conflict in their life. And that tells us that, hey, man, there are those risk factors that are out there, but also just nature itself and experiencing nature can be good for our brains. And I'll wrap up with that thought. Many scientists have the viewpoint that spending time in nature can actually restore our brain health. There's an idea called attention restoration theory. And the idea is that by being out in the world and seeing things like these beautiful blowing winds through this grass, it engages our attention, but it doesn't demand that we act on it or think about it. And this provides some good input for our brain without overwhelming our brain. And in that sense, can lead to better cognitive function, better brain health, and a better life. So in that sense, the environment has those risks that we talked about, but I would never want anyone to think that being out in nature wasn't good for their brain, because of course, being out in nature is great for our brain. So I'll stop there for a minute then, Stephanie.
All right, sounds good. Thank you so much, Henry, for the presentation. Let's go ahead and have Jody, if you want to go ahead and come back on camera.
Hey,
All
Jody.
right, fantastic. All right, so I will leave it to you two. Henry, you can go ahead and reintroduce Jody for the discussion.
Well, first of all, it's great to have you here, Jody. We had that wonderful introduction for you, but probably nice to say that you're also a Posit Science alumna, and we had the pleasure of working together for a number of years when you were at Posit Science. It's nice to have you back.
Of course, many formative years at Positive Science, and also actually working on aspects that you touched on today. So delighted to have this conversation with you.
Well, absolutely. So, of course, when you were here at Posit Science, you were working on attention training. You ran a kind of a revolutionary study on brain training in kids with ADHD. I know that you're still working on attention and brain imaging and all kinds of cool stuff like that in your lab at UC San Diego. But you've also developed this broader issue around the environment and brain health. And before we talk about some of those specific issues, I wonder if you might just sort of tell us, how did your research interest kind of expand in this way?
Yes, I think it actually started at the time that I was working at Posit Science. And an incredible aspect of attention is that we have this yin yang, sort of a push pull between what we need to pay focused attention to, the goal of our a task, versus what is distracting information. And that distracting information needs to be suppressed, and that can be noise. And that's the noise pollution that we get from our environment. And also as we age, as our signal processing gets poorer, those distractions can, get worse. And then our brain's ability to handle distractions get worse over time. And
Yeah.
so, with leadership from Dr. Merzenich, who heads the scientific division at BrainHQ, we thought a lot about training these abilities on how to enhance these processing of distractions. And at the same time, you mentioned ADHD. I was working on aspects of ADHD that also collide with other aspects of human development, such as in kids who come from under-nurtured environments. It shows symptoms of ADHD. So, you'd imagine that they do not have the right typical environment that we are used to growing up in. And then while I was doing that work, I started looking at family environments, and from that kind of broadening out to community environments and the climate around us. And so that's how this work evolved, but definitely Posit has a big role in that.
Well, it's an incredible expansion of your research interests, and really interesting to think about how we sort of moved, or how you moved from the sort of the personal about how ADHD might affect a kid to all the environmental risk factors that might contribute to the brain health of that kid. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, hey, let's talk about wildfires in particular. Now, that's something that we've both experienced here as California residents, and of course, in the news right now because of the Canadian wildfires and all this news from the East Coast. So, tell us a little bit. How did you start to get interested in wildfires in particular as a risk factor for brain health?
Well, wildfires were definitely, as they were happening in our communities, and that we could actually see the smokes in our cities. And my work in the field actually started by chance. I was definitely interested in studying aspects of climate change, but the work did not begin until my son one day came up with a penny drive and said that we are collecting donations with pennies for a wildfire, which was
My
actually
goodness.
the campfire study came out from that. The campfire was unfortunately the deadliest fire in California that happened in the Paradise area in 2018. And as soon as I heard about the penny drive, I actually called up people in that area who were leading the penny drive, and we had long conversations about the mental health impacts that people were suffering from. And what they were telling me was quite distressing, and it was anecdotal. So we decided that we would actually try to quantify this scientifically, because this extreme weather events that we're seeing at high frequency, in which wildfires are also part of that, we're not used to that. And so how is the mental health being impacted in that context? There's actually not that much work in that field, and we thought it would be a good avenue and opportunity to go in and do a community-based study.
Well, that's an incredible story, starting with your kid and bringing you onto this whole new form of research. Now, you and I are both neuroscientists. We know that mental health and brain health are really kind of two sides of the same coin, and they're deeply related. I think a lot of people might sort of hear, well, gosh, a person might go through a wildfire experience. Of course, they're going to be, kind of stressed out about it, or they might feel quite depressed if bad events have happened. But I know that you're thinking about this, in those psychological terms in those mental health terms, but also in terms of brain health terms. So what did you see from your study, and how did you think about the relationship then between that wildfire exposure and brain health risks?
Yeah, so we led actually a series of studies. In the first study, we were looking at the psychological effects, and this was nearly 1,000-person study in the Paradise area. And we saw that very clearly, if we look at symptoms of distress, such as post-traumatic stress disorder or depression or anxiety, they can be about threefold, 2 to 3-fold what we observe in the regular non-exposed communities. And
Wow.
the first work then led to new work that we ended up doing with a sub cohort of these individuals, and about 100-person study where we were looking at aspects of brain health and cognitive health. And we went into the communities doing brain recordings, not MRI recordings like you showed, because sometimes MRI can be very expensive to do, but there are other technologies like EEG where you can measure brain waves at a much more cheaper and scalable fashion. So we went in with that, and we did find that people who had been directly exposed to the wildfires were very much different in their brain function than people who have never been exposed. We actually saw a grade that people who were directly exposed were most impacted versus people who are indirectly exposed. Indirectly exposed individuals are those who have witnessed the wildfire event in their community, but they have not suffered any personal loss, such as family members being hurt or property loss. So the indirectly exposed individuals were somewhere in the middle, and then there are the non-exposed Californian residents. Again, what we found very much relevant to some of the work that you've shown with the auditory pollution, what we found was that the wildfire effects were actually making our distractor processing poorer. So the
Wow.
ability to process conflict was being highly impacted, and people were performing at 20% less performance level than controls. And when we go on to look at brain function, some of the frontal executive functional areas were actually performing at a highly alert or hyper aroused state. So this
Huh.
happens actually in a threat response, where if everything in our environment is very threatening to us, then the brain tends to put a tag that everything could be relevant. So it's
Uh,
trying to over process information, and it's thus constantly hyper aroused. At least that's
this
the theory in the
this
field.
terrible thing has happened, and so the brain thinks, well, something terrible might happen again. I need to be at top alert, right?
Exactly.
Hmm.
And, in the short term, so in the acute term and after the fires, I think this kind of a response can be very adaptive. It can help you, take you away from danger. What we worry about as scientists and then also clinicians is that these effects, when they last chronically in the long term, that can really impact health and well-being.
And I don't know if you've had a chance to look at this or not, but do you think those effects are going to sort of wear off, or do you think they're going to be sort of more, I hesitate to say permanent, Jody, but sort of maybe the more longer term rewiring or changes that have happened to brain health as a result of both the traumatic experience itself and as a result of the actual, the inhalation of all of this particulate matter and toxins and God knows what was going into the air. So is this something that we think you're going to be looking at in these poor people 5 or 10 years from now, or do you think, hey, they're going to bounce back pretty quick?
I think it's really important to look at that. We haven't looked at it longitudinally, but we're making those efforts, and includes getting the funding to do that kind of work. It's important because this is a different kind of trauma we're talking about. It is not like going to like a war zone and getting impacted by trauma once, post-traumatic stress. It's climate trauma is something that we might experience on a yearly basis, especially with
Right.
vulnerable communities,
Especially
right?
here in
So
California. It doesn't seem like it's going. We had a good year this year because we got some rain, but it doesn't seem like
exactly.
it's changed our long-term kind of prognosis for these kinds of fires. Oh.
Yeah, so I think long-term adaptation is definitely something we need to look at in terms of brain health. At the same time, my views always remain positive because our brains are plastic, and we, as humans, find ways to, learn from our environment and the services that we have and the stimuli that we give to our brain to have, bounce back and really have. Positive outcomes in the future. So I think with proper support, individuals in our communities can have better brain health.
Well, I mean, you raise a really interesting point. There's a lot of things, as I mentioned in my talk, that we can do in our individual lives to build better brain health, whether that's exercising or eating a brain healthy diet or doing brain training. Some of the issues we talked about today seem, so broad, right? I can't really control whether or not it's going to be a smoky day in San Francisco, right? I can't really control the fact that many people, including myself, drive in San Francisco. But as you look about these sort of both narrow issues and broader issues, I mean, what are the things you think that we as a society might be thinking about doing? I mean, I have to look back to the early 70s. We passed the Clean Water Act, we passed the Clean Air Act because we saw these negative effects that pollution was having on our bodily health. Are there things you think we should start to be thinking about doing in a societal level around our brain health and what we should be thinking about to reduce these risks of pollution on our brain health?
Yes, absolutely. I think there needs to be new policies around this. There's currently actually an act in Congress that's called the Community Mental Wellness and Resilience Act. And
Oh,
this is part of the Biden administration's climate change and equity efforts. And these kinds of efforts are meant to provide greater mental health care access and resources, especially to our most vulnerable communities living in zones where such aggravated weather events happen. And this includes wildfires in California, but say on the East Coast, they're not just wildfires, but hurricanes and other such events may also be aggravated by climate change. So we definitely need more resources, and having such mental health support can alleviate symptoms in the long term. So supporting that act, we can actually do that as individuals and as organizations. And so I'd really encourage people to support that kind of policymaking.
well, I like that thought because I don't want people to think that we just have to sit back and let these things happen to our brains. There's things we can do locally and perhaps at the societal level to help on that. And hey, on that optimistic note, I have to ask you about a whole different topic. It sounds like your kids have been very influential in your work, and I know that's true for me as well. Whenever I talk to them about brain science and brain health, new ideas come up for me. But you've taken that quite a bit further, and I saw that just recently you had a book came out called The Little Brain. And it's a children's book about brains. Tell me and everyone here, what led you to strike out in this direction and write a book in that sense? And how does a neuroscientist write a children's book anyway?
Well, yes, it's been a really interesting journey, Henry. Thanks for asking about it. So, The Little Brain is really a journey about learning from a child's perspective. A child, starts out with many dreams and they want to do many different things. And so, how do they achieve that? And how do they focus down on their actual goals? And so this is just their journey through life, and in that journey, they meet a brain scientist and they have conversations, and we talk about the key aspects of learning and what it takes to learn well, which are some of the things we discussed today. How do we pay attention better? And part of that whole process is also sharing with others. In the end, we actually learn a lot from discussing these topics with other people. And so the book just goes through a journey of this child and all the things that he does as he grows and is able to get to the goals that he has. And yeah, like you said, my family, my kids were definitely a part of the inspiration for me to sort of translate the work that I do on a daily basis, which can get very technical and full of jargon, to something that they can, take and, process and potentially feel inspired by. And so, yeah, I think it's gotten a good reception, and I think it's a great book actually to have new learning conversations. So when kids are trying to have challenges around learning, those challenges are what we are really are, great moments where we grow as individuals, and how do we have positive conversations around that. I've heard a lot of parents said that the book helped with that. So
That
yeah,
makes a ton of sense to me, helping kids understand, hey, what is the role of their brains as they're navigating these challenges, and then how can they change to navigate them better is wonderful. Well, that's amazing. You've done so much, everything from the details of building cool cognitive training exercises to the complexities of running clinical trials to this broader work around brain health and the environment to writing a book. That's all amazing, Jody. The bad news for you is that means I'm going to give you all the hard questions now that are coming from our audience, because you're so talented and can address them. Stephanie, it looks
I'll try to help.
Of course you will. We're getting some pretty interesting questions here, Stephanie. I see one or two, but do you see one or two you want to kick us off with?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I want to start by circling back to the topic of sound pollution a little bit here. We have a couple of people who have written in asking about whether white noise is okay to listen to. What about people who listen to TV in the background all the time? What are sort of the effects of that over time, or that kind of exposure over time on the brain?
Wow. Well, that is a good question. There's sort of one question around just watching some TV, but I've been in a lot of households where the TV's just kind of on all the time in the background, kind of regardless of what you're doing, cooking dinner or talking. Jody, what do you think about that kind of ongoing kind of background noise, as you put it, when you were thinking about your experiments in attention?
Yeah, I think, we can also draw from some of the work that you presented today. I think this kind of noise, whether it's white noise or TV noise, is not good for us if it's being run, 20 hours a day, 18 to 20 hours a day. Even if you look at the rodent experiments that you showed, some of those manipulations were done with pretty much all day noise exposure. So what we want to remember is that we want to do things in moderation. Of course, if you like white noise to sleep in, and you're doing it for short periods of time, I don't think there's evidence to say that may actually affect your brain poorly. So I think it depends on the dose of these noise factors.
I think that's almost certainly right. And but putting something out there that you're requiring your brain to ignore all the time, kind of adds an extra load to your brain and can interfere with processing. So the right amount is probably the right answer on that front.
Yeah. Now, speaking about continuing talking about noises, a lot of people have written in asking about tinnitus, having that internal noise, that internal mechanism in your brain. Can you talk about any risks that having tinnitus may lead to later in life?
Yeah, do you want to take a swing at that, Jody, or should I say a few words?
I know that there are a couple of studies that have shown that there's a non-significant risk of tinnitus related to dementia, and about 3% of individuals with tinnitus will develop that, but it seems small, but it still came out as non-significant in studies. But, Henry, you've done work in this domain too.
Yeah, I certainly, my take on and first of all, tinnitus is very complex and confusing literature. We still don't understand terribly well the root neuroscience that underlies it. I generally think of tinnitus as coming on more due to like that kind of acute noise exposure, right? Again, Pete Townsend from The Who, legendary for having developed quite problematic tinnitus, not because he had low noise all the time, but because he had very loud noise, for certain focused periods of time. So in the same sense that hair cell loss seems to come from that, perhaps tinnitus as well. I'm not particularly aware that just being around traffic noise or things like that over long periods of time can lead to tinnitus. But Jody, if you showed me a study at some point that said it did, I wouldn't be that surprised, right? If we think of that background noise as slowly leading to these problems in brain health and resilience, Well, once your brain starts to have those kinds of resilience problems, you're at risk for all kinds of things, whether it's cognitive function issues, whether it's dementia. I wouldn't be at all surprised if putting your brain in that risky compromised state led to an increased risk of tinnitus as well. It's a great question.
All right. And so we have a couple of people concerned about the well-being of first line responders, firefighters and such, who have seemingly the most exposure to wildfires in these sort of dire situations. Have there been any studies conducted on firefighter populations specifically? And if so, is there any sort of tracking of adverse effects on their health and well-being?
I think that's definitely a very vulnerable population. I have not seen studies of brain health in this population. What I have seen is that our communities are very much aware of the vulnerability of our firefighters. So some of the things that Henry talked about in the end, such as nature-based solutions and having a stress-free engagement with the natural environment, those kinds of initiatives are being worked out for our firefighters, especially in the wildfire zones, to help them with their mental well-being and resilience building.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And we should think about helping them bounce back in that way, right? If a firefighter was to, I don't know, twist a knee during a firefighter rescue, right? We would give that person rehab. We would help them bounce back in their physical health. And we really need to think about their brain health in the same way. If they're exposed to a lot of these pollutants during their fire, they're experiencing these very stressful events, we should be giving them tools to help them have their brain health bounce back, whether that's some time in nature, whether it's tools like something like BrainHQ or physical exercise, other kinds of things like that. The only thing I'll add to it is I am aware of some first studies that looked at first responders after the 9/11 attacks in New York. And of course, many deleterious health consequences on those folks. And of course, how heroic, right? Rushing into these burning buildings at risk of their life. And issues that come up around lung health and various things like that. But there have been some issues around brain health as well, suggesting that some of these exposure to these toxic events of being in the World Trade Center environments may have caused some longer term brain health issues for that population as well. So I'd like to see us as a society taking care of everyone who's in vulnerable brain health risks for that reason.
Yeah, absolutely. Now we did just mention in that answer, having that positive exposure to nature, having that. Somebody had noted the screen that you had, Henry, specifically that was sharing that wheat field blowing in the wind. Would they were asking, would a nature background or a slideshow, like on a TV or on a PC, give some sort of benefit of a good view, similar to those, people in those apartment buildings that may or may not have had a good view of greenery outside their window. What are your thoughts on that?
What do you think, Jody? Something better than nothing, or just having a screenshot of it mean you don't actually go out in nature and enjoy it?
Well, find every opportunity to go out in nature. That's definitely beneficial. When you don't have that, I think there have been a couple of studies that have looked at nature breaks that are still computerized breaks, and they are more helpful than, say, taking a phone break. So I'd say, yes, take time to, at least engage one sense, which is the visual sense in this case, in a natural environment. When you go out in actual real nature, you're engaging all your senses. And so it's a much more impactful and positive experience. But yes, something better than nothing.
I agree. I'm always in this something is better than nothing agreement myself, taking some breaks, enjoying some pictures, enjoying perhaps thinking about being outside, but don't let that be enough for you, right? If you could get out on the weekends or take a walk after work or go outside during lunch, that's even more helpful. I can't help but be reminded by the Washington State Department of Parks on Twitter yesterday, said that it was important for brain health that once you work for 20 minutes at a desk, you should take a 20-minute break and be in nature, and then you should go live in the woods for 20 years afterwards. That would be the Washington Department of Parks' ideal brain health. I don't know if all of us can do that, but I appreciated their ambition.
Look, if you set up a Wi-Fi router in the woods, I'm there.
I think if you have the Wi-Fi router in the woods, you might not be getting the brain health benefits of the woods.
That's also probably a problem. I did not think this one through.
Sorry to give you that news. Once you can get Facebook there, I don't know it's good for you anymore.
Sure. All right, so I think we're going to go ahead and start wrapping up the webinar here. But I do have a slide with some information about Jody and her book. I know quite a few of you had been asking about Jody's book. So you can see a little bit more information on the screen now. So the book is called The Little Brain. You can find it on Amazon and other other booksellers, I'm sure. And we had a couple people ask what the intended age group was for the book.
It's about from a preschool to elementary age kids, so K through 5, especially pre-K through 5.
Fantastic. All right, so all that information is there on the screen, and if you don't have the time to write it down now, it'll be in the recording, and we'll be sure to include a link to that book in the replay description next week. All right, so let's go ahead and get to wrapping up here. So thank you all again so much for participating in the webinar today. Thank you, Henry, for running it. Thank you, Jody, for joining us and taking all of those wonderful questions from our audience members. It was absolutely delightful having you here today. Now we have another webinar coming up next month. What makes BrainHQ effective? The science behind the exercises. Get a look at the gears that make BrainHQ run. That's going to be taking place on July 12th. So look for an invite to come out a week before that. Henry, Jody, do you have any final parting words that you want to share with our audience?
Oh, just Jody, it was wonderful to see you and talk about these incredibly important issues. And thanks to everyone for coming to this webinar. And like I always say at the end, happy brain training. Get out into the world some, but if you're going to be sitting behind a computer, do a little BrainHQ. That'll be good for your brain too. Jody, anything from you to wrap up?
Yeah, really great to be here, Henry and Stephanie, and thank you for providing this really important information to everyone. And I'd say, yeah, get out in nature. And also, I think there's evidence to say that if you engage in community problems, such as the increasing risk of weather events and climate change, we together as a community, when we voice our opinions and try to solve them, it's actually good for our mental health and well-being. So get out there with your families and friends, and we can do this together.
That's a wonderful thought. Thank you for wrapping us up like that, Jody. Stephanie, thank you for hosting us. And everyone else, happy day and happy brain training.